Good afternoon, everyone. Perfect. Hi, everyone. My name is Marcello, and as we just heard, I spent the past 5 or 6 years working across 20 or so countries on the continent in the technology and innovation space with startups, with entrepreneurs, with new technologies. And I just want to talk today a little bit about the things I've seen and the things I've witnessed, and introduce you into this world that I think is not something that we hear about often here in Germany and in Europe. And so when I was asked by the organizers to speak, and they told me that the topic is parallel worlds, I thought, what a perfect topic to introduce people into this often unknown parallel world of innovation and entrepreneurship on the continent. So my journey started about 6 years ago. And back then, I had not really been on the continent. I hadn't had much exposure. And so what I knew about the continent is probably very similar to a lot of the things that people know about the continent here today. We often hear about the continent of poverty. We hear about the continent where people are in need and the dust in the streets. For those of us that have watched The Lion King, maybe we've heard of the continent of animals, of safaris, of lions, the place where, metaphorically speaking, planes can't land because lions cross the runway. I mean, these are the questions that you get sometimes. But I think the biggest thing we often hear about, and it's something that happens every day on the streets here, is we hear about the continent that needs our help. Right? If you cross the streets anywhere in Europe, you'll get stopped by people that say, with 10 euros, you can save the life of an African child, putting the price on a life and giving you the feeling that you are the person that has saving the continent in their hands. And what I've discovered in the past years, and what I've been privileged to witness, is the exact opposite. And I've come to believe that the future is actually being built on the continent of Africa. Now, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about why I think that is, but before that, I want to take you onto the journey that I've been through and how I've kind of come to be privileged enough to experience this. So, as all good things, it started with a stupid idea on a bus. About 6 years ago, a friend of mine called me and said, hey, I'm doing this thing called Startup Bus, driving from Harare in Zimbabwe to Cape Town in South Africa. It's like a 5-day trip, and you get together with about 30 entrepreneurs on a bus, building out ideas, stopping along innovation hubs and centers, and kind of getting a sense for the vibe of the startup space on the continent. And I was exposed to an incredible amount of people building really cool tech, using technology to solve the problems they saw on the ground, and I found it incredibly captivating. And I was like, how can I support? How can I get involved? And so over the years after, I joined an incubator that helped startups across the continent succeed. And now for the past 2.5 years, I've actually been in a local South African fintech startup myself, looking at growing the company into other African markets. Originally, I'm from Austria. I'm half Austrian, half Italian, and now I live in South Africa full-time. But what I've basically gotten to see and gotten to witness is basically a continent that is growing incredibly fast. You have economies that are growing 10%, 12% a year, incredible growth. You have population that is incredibly young. The average age on the continent is about 18, 19 years. So you have a good 600, 700 million people on the continent that have not even reached 20 years of age. And cities are growing incredibly fast. Out of the 30 fastest growing cities in the world, 21 are in Africa. And by 2030, there's going to be cities that are 5 or 10 million people big that you may have never heard of. Dar es Salaam and Kinshasa are going to be cities of 10 million people. Abuja is going to be a city of 5. And cities like Lagos and Cairo and Johannesburg are going to grow even more. So by 2030, you're probably going to have the 5 biggest cities on the continent being as big as all of Germany, just to give you a sense for the scale and the size. It's absolutely incredible. But what this is also doing, this is creating a massive opportunity for people to build their own innovation, to build their own businesses, to build their own solution for their own problems. And so this is something that I've been privileged enough to witness, and I'm really, really, really passionate about. So what these people are also doing, and I think we've heard this from previous speakers as well, they're also kind of challenging the theory of development, right? Because if we think about development, generally speaking, we think about development as a continuum of undeveloped and developed, right? You can think probably somewhere on the left of undeveloped, you'd have a metaphorical North Korea, and on the right, you'd have a metaphorical America, and countries can only move along this line, along this artificial continuum. But the reality is that that's not how it works, right? As we heard earlier today, it's not that we are at the pinnacle of development and everybody's just trying to catch up to us. People and countries and regions are developing their own way of developing. They're leapfrogging certain technologies, they're leapfrogging certain steps of development, and are charting their own path. And why is that important? Because one thing we often don't realize sitting here is that what we today call the developed world is actually becoming less and less relevant in the global context. Today already, you've got about 90% of the population of the world that lives in what we call an emerging market. And you have almost 40% of global GDP that comes from emerging markets. So we'll soon be in a situation where both the majority of the population and the majority of the economic output comes from the emerging, quote-unquote, emerging world. So, funny enough, we will be the minority. But why is that? But to kind of flip this on its head, why is this a massive opportunity for entrepreneurs in Africa and in other emerging markets? It's because they have the incredible opportunity to build solutions for local problems that are also relevant for the majority of the rest of the world, while at the same time working on problems that the quote-unquote developed world doesn't even know exist. We've heard a few innovations earlier, and I'm going to talk about a few others. So you have a massive information advantage because people sitting in Hamburg, people sitting in London, people sitting in Munich don't know the reality of living in an emerging market. Whereas somebody sitting in Kampala, somebody sitting in Kinshasa has a much bigger information advantage, and their knowledge scales to other markets. So this is really the big opportunity that I see for startups and innovation coming from the continent. Now, what I want to do now is kind of like take you on a bit of a tour and show you a few of interesting companies that I've seen and why they matter, and hopefully also challenge your perception a little bit of what kind of innovation can happen on the continent. So the first one, and maybe you've seen this before, it's a company called Zipline. Really incredible technology. They've now basically partnered with the government in both Rwanda and Ghana and are launching other markets to use drones to send medical supplies between hospitals across the country. Now, this system is live in both countries already, connecting dozens, if not hundreds, of hospitals. And what you see in the back is kind of how the process works, right? So you have a central dispatch center, blood supplies or medical supplies are loaded onto the drone, and then they fly autonomously to the hospital, drop the shipment, where it's then picked up and used. And what they've managed to do is essentially completely skip the step where they had to develop roads and put truck on the roads or manage supply across a distributed set of hospitals. But they've managed to basically do all of this automatically using drone technology. And then basically the drones fly back and are ready for the next delivery. And so what they've done is they've managed to reduce the delivery time for medical supplies across the country and into rural areas by orders of magnitude, which I think is quite impressive. Another thing that we may not hear about as much, can we turn the audio off if that's possible? Because we don't need it. So the other thing that's quite impressive is there's now a company in Rwanda that's manufacturing laptops. Volkswagen just opened a manufacturing plant in Rwanda as well, where they're manufacturing cars. So you're now starting to see, industries moving onto the continent to develop and build technology there to be used there on the ground. So this company in Rwanda is now distributing their laptops. They build all sorts of other hardware products, and then are distributing it to all parts of the continent. Another one which we actually quite just heard about is a company called Kobo 360. If you were paying attention, you heard about them already. The one thing that maybe I would add to Fosa's point about why this is so important is because there's a lot of countries on the continent that are landlocked and rely on shipping as their primary form of receiving goods, but also because that process is very, very inefficient. For example, a country like Nigeria receives the majority of their shipments actually from the neighboring country of Togo, because it's much more efficient for ships to come into Togo and then bring things over land than going into the Nigerian ports. So land delivery is a super, super, super important part of making making economies work and economies grow. Another company I'm particularly excited about is a company called Safe Boda. They're based in Uganda and in Kenya. Also a way of kind of ordering motorbikes on demand. And why is this important? It's because motorbike taxis are a super popular mode of transport across the continent and in a lot of other emerging markets. They're fast, they're not stuck in traffic, they're affordable, and you'd be surprised by how many things you can actually transport on a motorbike. I've seen families, I've seen goats, I've seen all sorts of stuff getting onto a bike. So they're a super, super powerful mode of transport across the continent. But what's interesting is that these companies can start with one thing, but then they grow in terms of their impact. So now what are these guys doing? They basically started bringing motorbike drivers who are fairly informal, super cash heavy, and essentially rely on being in the right place at the right time to get the ride. They now started including them into the financial ecosystem. So they now started giving them digital bank accounts that go on their phones. They started doing partnerships with petrol stations to make it cheaper for them to buy fuel. But then they're now also going into insurance products. So they're actually working with Allianz, the German insurance company, to give these motorbike drivers life insurance, health insurance. So what's basically happening is you're taking an industry that has kind of existed in the dark, right? Anybody could just get a bike, get onto the street, and start driving around. They took an industry that essentially existed in the dark and lifted it up into the formal sector and giving people opportunities to grow, to be safer, to do more business, but also to upskill. So the company itself is hiring a lot of their former drivers into other roles in the company and is helping them find jobs in other places to really kind of help them uplift themselves and their families economically. So that was just kind of a quick overview of some of the interesting companies. I mean, we could do this for days and ages. There's so many fantastic things. But what I really wanted to show you here is just the incredible potential that exists when companies on the continent take their own local problems, build solutions around them, and then realize that they can scale into other places. So all of the companies I've shown you have started in an African country and have now expanded to others and are growing quite aggressively from country to country. Because what you realize is that a problem in the streets of Kampala is very similar to a problem in the streets of Nairobi, and it's very similar to a problem in the streets of Lagos, and so on and so forth. So massive opportunity for growth, massive opportunity for scale, and massive opportunity to build that in areas where a lot of the Western world isn't even watching. So to wrap this up and to come to a conclusion, there's, I think, 3 big points I want you guys to take home. And one, and it's something that I'm quite passionate about, is we need to understand that we're going into a world where the majority of the world doesn't look like the streets of Hamburg, doesn't look like the streets of London, and we have not been exposed to, right? This is a really, really, really important point because these places are also not going to look like Hamburg or London or Berlin anytime soon. They're going to develop their own way of developing. They're going to develop their own way of functioning, and it's not going to look like here. So we also need to understand that there's going to be an incredible amount of companies and entrepreneurs and technologies coming out of Africa, coming out of India, coming out of other emerging markets that are going to scale across the developing world and into the rest of the world as well. We're already starting to see it with a lot of Chinese companies that are bringing innovation into some of our spaces, and this is only going to accelerate more and more. We don't have the monopoly on innovation anymore, if we've ever had that. And the last one, what we need to keep in mind with this is nobody's waiting for us. The world is developing incredibly fast by itself. People on the continent, people are taking things into their own hands. They're building their own innovations, their own products, their own businesses, their own solutions, their own technologies, their own everything. Nobody is sitting there waiting for somebody to come and fix their problem. People have much more energy, much more passion than that. And that's really something we need to keep in the back of our minds. So with that, I really just want to encourage you to do one thing, and that's kind of it's a statement I really, really like. And I think we all need to stop thinking about how Africa and the developed world can become more like us, and what we can do to make it look more like us. What we really should start looking at and thinking about is how can we learn from some of these places, from some of these innovations, from some of these technologies? What can we apply in our spaces from the things that are coming up in emerging markets and in Africa, and really, really use them as a place to learn from, and not as a place where we just go and export our products into. So with that said, I wanted to thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to talk to you. And yeah.
Thanks, Marcello. Thank you very much. Thank you. Just a quick question. You mentioned China briefly there. And we heard yesterday about how potentially China is better placed to be a partner, a trade partner for African businesses than perhaps in Europe. And your reference to Safe Boda there, I saw a lot of overlap, like creating this digital ecosystem and then business ideas sprouting off from that. Do you agree with that statement?
Yeah, so there's an interesting, I don't want to call it fight happening right now, but there's a lot of debate whether the Chinese influence or the Chinese example of how the country developed and how the tech space developed is something that African companies should look at, or if it's rather a Silicon Valley-based model. Mm-hmm. I think there's a lot of value in both. Right? I think in the same way that we shouldn't just go and blindly copy things from Silicon Valley, we shouldn't go and blindly copy things from Shenzhen either. But you have a country that has gone through that development of going from super informal to almost the largest economy in the world in a span of 20, 30 years. There's a lot you can learn from that. Mm-hmm. So I think you will see more and more companies taking a page out of the China playbook. You'll see companies taking pages out of the Silicon Valley playbook. Mm-hmm. But I think the thing that's really exciting is companies are going to use that to build their own playbooks. Yeah. Because China is not like America, China is not like Africa, Africa is not like America, Africa is not like China, and there's a big opportunity to just build your own playbook for how to do things.
Okay, so exciting times.
Absolutely.
The next 10 years.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. And Marcello will be on that panel later this afternoon, What's Up Africa, together with Fossa and myself.
Perfect.
Okay, see you then.